And the name of the third river is Hiddekel. That is it which goeth toward the east of Assyria. And the fourth river is Euphrates. And the Lord God took the man and put him into the garden of Eden to dress it and keep it. And the Lord God commanded the man, saying, of every tree of the garden, every tree of the garden, thou mayest freely eat, but of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, thou shalt not eat of it. In the day that thou eatest thereof, thou shalt surely die. Certainly die of innocence. And if you describe yourself as a scriptural literalist, perhaps a fundamentalist, or even a creationist, and you know who you are, then that is simply the way that it was by chapter 2 of the creation, as recorded in what is oft referred to, at least by theologians, as one of the books of history, Genesis through 1st and 2nd Chronicles, totaling 12 by most who perform some consolidation, but adding even more confusion for those looking at the 1st and 2nd Samuel, 1st and 2nd Kings, 1st and 2nd Chronicles, and the bifurcated books of Ezra and Nehemiah, which appears as two books in most modern Bibles that include the Pentateuch, our first 5 books, Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy, in the Torah. If you're not Jewish, you probably don't even understand any of this, and which appear nowhere in that pocket New Testament that somebody may have provided you at an airport. Probably very handy if you have a fear of flying and decide that last moment you need to find Jesus and work on your spiritual life before proceeding to your next destination, which may or may not be heaven. But by chapter 2, dear Adam and Eve in the paradise of Eden are already on their way to trouble, giving us original sin, in a story we also find told by John Milton in Paradise Lost, which you really should have read in your high school years, so we shall not tarry further on that path. But in the last installment of this rather topical series on the origins of viruses, taking the panoramic view and totality of the subject recently considered by the members of the intelligence community, of which I was formerly a part, and restricted under delegation of the president to the topic of whether a novel coronavirus had found its genesis or origins in a laboratory, or had in a Darwinian fashion evolved from some creature in nature still as yet unknown, which was perhaps, as we have suggested, a false dichotomy, a Scopes trial still yet for the modern era, with similar impacts upon the faith community. And picking up from where we had left off in our last video, discussing the 2010 works of Patrick Fortier on viruses, generally according to the science, as he notes in his scientific article that was published in February 2010, just a decade ago, very little still remains known about this scientific phenomenon of viruses. And by that time, he had stated that most of the knowledge that had been derived had been developed in only the prior 2 decades. It took centuries, almost a century, for us to get most of our knowledge. We were just waiting, and then suddenly we had an explosion of knowledge about viruses. Just like at the beginning, we had 1892, 1898, 1901, suddenly finding viruses, then everything just kind of falls off. Recall, if you can, and if you can't, just nod your head and say amen, that the electronic microscope, we all know that, was not discovered until 1932, around the time that the very first coronavirus was ever discovered, causative agent for avian bronchitis. Chickens sneezing and coughing and having respiratory problems. But some believe that with all of this lack of knowledge, Pfizer, Moderna, and Janssen were still able to develop an effective countermeasure to prevent the spread and transmission of a novel coronavirus, to give you an extra level of protection. And perhaps you are one of those people. But have you heard? Have you ever read one of the clinical study reports? Not just heard about someone talking about all these, have you actually ever read? Only inquire for the reasons of developing critical thinking skills, because even the 6-month study that had been prepared by Pfizer before the approval of their product by FDA, not the one that is in the New England Journal of Medicine published in December of 2020, December 2020, but the recent one. It was at the end of August, was titled the end of July, was titled 6-Month Safety and Efficacy of the BNT 162b2 mRNA COVID-19 vaccine. A study that was authored by Stephen J. Thomas and several others et al. And was available in preprint on July 28th of this year, just a few months ago, and has yet to be released upon peer review. And while safety and efficacy, that's right, it hasn't been peer reviewed yet. We've already got an approved vaccine, but it hasn't been peer reviewed. And while safety and efficacy are the standards for authorization under an emergency use, which was the former approval level, the standard for approval at FDA for new drug applications is safety and effectiveness. Sounds like efficacy, but it's not the same. They're clinically quite distinct, for which most times a developer possesses a knowledge of infectious dose, which remains an unknown quantum even over a year has passed. A quantum that a vaccine developer could use to measure serological titers to ensure that a sufficient amount of the correlates of protection are present, or that there is enough antibody protection to prevent a person from being infected or hospitalized or becoming a fatality after receiving an infectious dose of the amount of pathogen or agent that must be delivered to a healthy cell to infect it or cause it to be condition. But the topic of correlates of protection only became a topic at the White House briefing by Dr. Fauci in early August, like it was a brand new discovery in science. No, it's been around for years, decades. While the infectious dose is a quantity that we had requested specifically from CDC, the Virginia Department of Health, and even Dr. Fauci personally, before submitting a FOIA to the White House in March to determine if that quantifiable metric was somehow classified information, prompting a lawsuit at the beginning of July to compel a reply, because under Executive Order 12958, dated April 17, 1995, through the math to Bill Clinton, the government could not classify that information unless the government actually owned 2019 in COV. And Dr. Fauci has a very, very interesting email dated February 1st, 2020, where he's saying, hey, look at this virus that we helped to create. He started like coronavirus at the University of North Carolina. And you know that if you've been listening to your Tucker Carlson. But back to the viruses that, at least in the account in Genesis, might have developed in the primordial soup during the seas, during the soup, as early as which we call the seas, as early as day 3 in that creation account, and about which Charles Darwin did not even know existed in 1859. Well, at least by 1983, the year that Ralph Northern was graduating from VMI, and the year that I was graduating from Jesuit High School in New Jersey, and preparing to matriculate as a freshman at Washington to go to where Ralph had gone, down in Lexington, Shenandoah Valley. And evolving science had developed only 3 theories, or more appropriately, hypotheses, or educated guesses on exactly from where these viruses had emerged, if not from within the primordial soup in which we are now sufficiently immersed. And the source of this information was an article published by Claudiu Bandea, entitled A New Theory on the Origin and Nature of Viruses, that appeared in the Journal of Theoretical Biology. And at least according to Bandea, it was as early as 1967, just a year after June Almeida and David Arthur John Terrell in the United Kingdom, and Dorothy Hamre and John Prochnow at the University of Chicago were discovering the very first human coronavirus in their search for the causes of the common cold, for which the coronavirus that they discovered was just a co-infecting agent, one of many in the common cold, and which appeared most to them to be akin to the chicken coronavirus, like the very first coronavirus that had been discovered in 1932. And this is an important thing just to remember. It looked like a chicken coronavirus. Not a bat coronavirus, it looked like a chicken coronavirus. They're only found in animals that are mammals or birds in most advanced forms. But by 1974, according to Bandea, Loria, and Darnell had proposed what they had described as the Protobiont Theory, or hypothesis. Because generally in science, you cannot just announce a theory, like you can announce a effective vaccine, apparently these days, but rather you begin with a hypothesis based upon observation of some phenomenon, which you then test through clinical measures to attempt to replicate the predicted results. And the results, if successful for that hypothesis, is then presented to peers in the scientific community to also attempt to replicate those results to support a general consensus to form what Thomas Kuhn, the former professor of scientific philosophy at Harvard University, might describe as a paradigm in which the hypothesis becomes an established theory. Kind of gets majority votes. But Loria and Darnell in 1974, majority votes among scientists. You're not included inside that. It's not that democratic. But Loria and Darnell in 1974, relying upon earlier works, because you don't know the science, so why would we want your vote? Relying upon earlier works by Altenberg in 1946, began to advocate that the origin of viruses had emerged in the primordial soup as a precellular system that began to appear, or systems that began to appear and coexist with the earliest cells. Bandea kind of rejects this theory on the grounds that that have even been proposed in the current debate on the origins of a novel coronavirus, as the probability of an independent strand of RNA simply developing independently and in exactly the proper manner so as to develop the gain of function to infect any other organism to enable it to replicate and flourish was simply too far-fetched to accept. Kind of like our little problem with the ground sprouting up out of the water and being able to produce trees and grass all by itself without evolving over thousands of years and all that. And could have gotten lucky, enough land. And with the rejection of that hypothesis, we come now to the second hypothesis, was described as the regressive theory of parasitic reduction. That sounds very, very scientific. The regression theory, the parasitic reduction, first proposed by Green in 1935, had proposed that viruses had found their origins in bacteria. Makes sense. We knew bacteria that had mutated and reduced itself into the viral particle. Kind of broke off, or just, I don't know, Honey, I Shrunk the Kids. Something happened, bacteria reduced down to viruses. But Bandea also rejects this hypothesis based upon what is known about bacteria. First, that bacteria, unlike viruses, outside a host organism are actually life. But they're a very, very interesting form of life. And he rejected the possibility that a bacterial organism might, even through a process of natural selection, devolve itself, moving in the other direction in mutant strains so as to produce a new type of biological particle in the form of a virus, which, when separate from a host cell, is just a single strand of RNA, or sometimes even DNA, but which actually transforms itself into an RNA component or RNA replicase upon introduction to a new host cell. So when the DNA virus hits the human host, it's going to change. It's going to change to an RNA. RNA is basically the default form of the virus. And secondly, he rejects this hypothesis because, distinct from what is known about viruses, bacteria have absolutely nil metabolic activity. Very, very unique life form. No metabolic activity. We know just in terms of the SARS, this is the SARS that preceded the SARS-2, there's a lot of metabolic activity that is going to be going on as it tries to engage at that furin cleavage site. And this is how it infects. We also know that this metabolic activity is actually responsible for all coronaviruses. Because they were the largest genome, they had a natural tendency to fall apart. The mass was just too large for it to sustain. And so through this enzymatic activity, they developed a stabilizing core around the center so that mutations were only possible at either end. And even by 1983, Bandea observed that that hypothesis was already losing support in the scientific community. We'll get more into this thing about the coronavirus in the next video. The third hypothesis, first proposed by Burnett in 1965, which Bandea also rejected, was the endogenous hypothesis. I like that one, endogenous, which had proposed that the origins of viruses might be found in autonomous subsystems. Autonomous subsystems, kind of independent, of existing cells that developed a parasitic genetic program. Already had their own little program. We're going to make parasites. Even though he had found this hypothesis the most promising, he only rejected it because only one other scientist had even considered that hypothesis briefly after he had done it. Andrews in 1967. Perhaps because, as Bandera had suggested, even Burnett had not provided many details to explain his hypothesis. He just kind of threw it out there and brainstorming, especially on the most critical question as to how this transformation from a cellular system had transformed itself into an independent non-cellular system, leaving it an open question, kind of like some of the holes that were left inside the Christian Anderson report on zoonotic evolution back in March of 2020, but which nobody has any problem with. Like many describe the situation for determining the origins of a novel coronavirus. But Bandea exploits this gap in science. It's an opportunity, danger opportunity, to propose a wholly new hypothesis on his own, or that's what he calls it, but taking parts from the work before him, akin to Galileo, who had said of his work that he had stood on the shoulders of giants. And he concludes, and this may require some explanation, especially if you're not a scientist, even if one tries to determine the advantages, I'm quoting our scientists here, even if one tries to determine the advantages the cell might have obtained by fixing genetic mutations that might have led to the endogenous appearance of viruses, and here he cites to the works of Poindexter in 1976 regarding this idea that viruses may have found origins through growth in cellular tissue, which is what endogeny suggests. That's what that term means. These arguments, now back in his quote, these arguments seem weak in comparison to present argument. Weak in comparison to present argument regarding the reproductive function through spores in established parasites. Selection at the molecular level inside the host cell would not permit the development of an endogenous system with a parasitic genetic program, basically admitting that there would be some autoimmune response to expel it. You have a revolution inside your cell, an insurrection inside your cell. Your body is not just going to sit around and let it happen. They'll probably respond quicker than happened at the Capitol when 3,000 people walked in. It is also difficult to imagine how a parasitic system could develop a divergent evolution towards complexity in a cellular medium. You're simply positing that an autoimmune response would certainly disrupt any broad pattern, mass revolution of development by rogue invasive genomes that had mutated and developed with cellular structures within cellular structures of tissue. Back to his quote, the aforementioned selection could only be countered by a strong parasitic genetic program, organized, well adapted to this particular medium, and it is doubtful that this genetic program could have had an accidental endogenous origin. He has kind of a, his own theory in terms of, engineered in a lab is totally where this could happen what's inside the cell. It was inside a human host, within a living being, a plant, an animal. You're just not going to have this level of organization happening just by chance, by accident. Although it cannot be, back into his quote, although it cannot be practically decided if modern types of viruses have monophyletic or polyphyletic origins. Okay, pause again. Monophyletic meaning being developed from a single common ancestral form, one ancestor, kunda kinte. And polyphyletic, it's opposite in plural, because kind of like Freddy Krueger. But you had to see the movie. Because of the lack of any evidence of their phylogeny, it is likely they have had a common origin since they share the same major characteristics and organization of their ontogenetic cycle. Ontogenetic, pause to explain, ontogenetic being derived from ontogeny, which simply means a development or course of development of an individual organism. Hence, ontogenetic, meaning based upon visible morphological characters or similar form. You know, hey, you got your daddy's nose. Basically the idea. Okay, as herein developed, divergent, back into his quote, as herein developed, divergent parasitic reduction could be responsible for the appearances of the different kinds of viruses, small as well as large. Other hypotheses, he even says hypotheses, have been unable to account for the diversity of viruses without accounting for polyphyletic origins. Essentially here, he is granting a possibility that despite his earlier rejection, the regressive theory of parasitic reduction, remember that one, finds strength in accounting for the different types of viruses that other hypotheses had not addressed. The only way that we could have so many. And here Bandera moves towards his final conclusion. He's going to pull it all together. He's coming in, church. Quote, in summary, the viruses should be considered as organisms which develop their morphologically dispersed, physiologically active vegetative phase intracellularly, and which reproduce through inert unitary morphological forms, the virions, or complete virus particle, distinct from what are described as virion. Okay, this is interesting. Here, Bandea provides an example of some of the controversy just about viruses and virologic terminology, such as Patrick Fortier had addressed in his 2010 work, where he had attempted, tried really hard to explain that confusion between the virus and their virion he actually says this has become the paradigm of virology. Confusion is the paradigm. Confusion in virology is the status quo. As he states that, quote, for a long time, viruses have been defined by their virions, the viral particles produced during infection. Okay, and he places some blame on the media, stating that the confusion, not folks on social media, but the media. And he places some blame on the media, stating that the confusion between the virus and the virion is still apparent both in the media and parenthetically, he says, the AIDS virus on TB is shown as a sphere with spikes, kind of like our modern coronavirus is shown on TV with spikes. The virion, he says that this is the virion, not the virus. This is the virion, not the virus. This is what he says. And in the scientific literature, when it is claimed that viruses are 10 times more abundant than bacteria in the ocean, it is meant that viral particles are 10 times more abundant. Not viruses, but the virion. Okay, so if you're having a problem with the science of novel coronavirus, and 66% of Democrats in July said they had confidence they understood all of this crap, Even the scientists who apparently permit biohazardous materials, according to our intelligence community now, to escape from laboratories, imagine what we do with government secrets, frequently they cannot decide the difference between a virus and the virions. It's a virus, it's a virion, it's a virus, it's all the same. While some also apparently continue a debate as to whether a virus can actually be described as life. So they're confused just about this topic, and we're developing vaccines and running away from a novel coronavirus. Nonetheless, Bandea's final conclusion still requires some explanation about the vegetative phase that he described as showing the major physiological properties of other organisms. Metabolism, growth, reproduction. You know, you have your signs of life. You got metabolism, you grow, you reproduce. And it's only in this vegetative state that the virus actually begins to have it. In some of his prior observations, that viruses are considered to be organisms that pass through two distinct phenotypic stages. And a phenotype being the observable characteristics or traits of an organism that are produced by the interaction of the genotype and its environment. The physical expression of one or more genes. We're going to start to see some form. Something's happening here. It's not just, non-viable crap. Or even viable with potential to do something. Number one, this is what he said. The vegetative stage, in which the morphological structure has its component subsystems, the different molecules of viral nature dispersed into the host cell. And so you know all about this with the H2 enzyme and engagement that the fear included. The previous stage may be included here. So we talked about that prior state when it's just kind of out there in the environment. Some of that may be included here, but this is going to be very, very big inside the vegetative state that we're going to start to see these morphological structures, component subsystems. And number two, the phenotypic stage, represented by viral particles or nucleic acid. And we hear this a lot in the, cleavage engagement. Active life, he explains, occurs only in the vegetative stage. Active life, he explains, occurs only in the vegetative stage in the interior of the host cell, or in a likely environment, maybe in vivo, or maybe in vitro. Could be either or. You can make it in a lab. Hint, hint. In the ontogenetic stage, back to his quote, in the ontogenetic stage of viral particle or nucleic acid, life is but a potential. Life is but the fleeting shadow. No, life is but a potential property encoded in the viral nucleic acid. The virus's functional structure in the vegetative phase imposes identification of the virus's morphological structure with all its subsystems, even though they are non-cohesive. So, you got all that? Got all that? Do you understand that? Do you understand that? 66% of you should already know this, so this is all review. Finally, we began to talk a little bit in the first video about some philosophy terms of logic to assist in becoming a more discerning Christian, more discerning voter, more discerning just normal everyday Joe. Because we don't want a smooth-talking salesman at a car dealership to see us coming and say to himself, "Would you look at this sucker?" But say to us that you look like an intelligent person, so he can get a great commission, because we fail to remember what Jesus said to his disciples, that he sent us as what? Sheep amongst the wolves. You don't want to be Jules saying, "Oh, you said you were sending the wolf, and I'm just going to sit here and wait for the cavalry." You'll be waiting for the cavalry, all right. You are not wrestling just against flesh and blood, but against principalities, against powers, against rulers of darkness of this world, against wickedness and in high places. Where was the blind man in the account in Mark or John before his miracle meeting with a man named Jesus? He was like Al Pacino in Sin of a Woman, saying, "I'm in the dark, Charlie. I've been to the crossroads in this life. I always knew what the right path was, without exception. I knew, but I never took it. And you know why? Because it was too damn hard. So he walked away, missed his shot at the moon. He could have been a contender. Why does Rice play Texas? John F. Kennedy asked. Not because it is easy, but because it is hard. Charlie Sims in the movie, when he came to that crossroad, in his life, he chose the right path. It was the right one. The path made a principle, and that's the path, young soldier, that leads to good character. Are you ready to make that journey? Are you ready to take that leap of faith? AIDA, attention. I know I have your attention. You're on the lot with a pocket full of money and you want to buy. Interest. I know that you're interested because you don't listen to church stuff this long if you are not a little bit interested, especially not for a half hour. Decision. Have you made your decision for Christ? Action. You need not answer now. God doesn't promise anyone tomorrow. You want to be waiting too late. You want to be that guy on the news trying because he should have gotten the vaccine. Now he's trying to tell his friends not to make the mistake that he did, like Yul Brynner on smoking. Scared to death and willing to say anything. Trying to save his soul and looking like a fool to everybody else. But that is enough tough love for now. How do you feel? It is a great day to be in the army of the Lord. Our next topic will be another exploration in science, building on our refreshed knowledge, prayerfully, or even newfound knowledge, because all of the beautiful ladies in online dating, spiritual but not religious, always say in their profiles online that they are really enjoy a lot learning new stuff. And I can't quite figure out if that is even English. We shall, in the current public health crisis of vogue, approach the Penumbra, a wonderful word, even used by Justice Scalia in a Supreme Court opinion, which actually combines two Latin phrases, umbra, or shadow, which we actually found in the motto of our Jesuit high school, celebrating its 150th anniversary this year, sub umbra petri, or under the shadow of the rock, or Peter, prompting an inquiry in a previous video series as to whether your little light that shines or your city set apart atop a hill in your church cast a light into the world or cast a shadow. We have time for a little digression, at least for our own edification and etymology. Umbra, which you may recognize from a college entrance exam, forming the root of the word umbrage, meaning shadow, darkness, or shade. And we find the word pane, or paini, at least the sisters at St. Dominic always pronounce the AE sound as I and not A, and which is a modifier that means nearly, almost, or practically, giving us in Penumbra the idea of the furthest of the most furthest outline of a shadow. And the folks at Merriam-Webster help us out by providing us with 4.5 definitions. A space of partial illumination, a shaded region surrounding the dark central portion of a sunspot, fringe, body of rights. Oh, there's a good one. A body of rights, Penumbra. A body of rights held to be guaranteed, not by expressed authority, but implied in a civil constitution. And something that covers, surrounds or obscures like a shroud, as in Professor Kingsley saying in the paper chase, "You've been shrouded, Mr. Hart." Have you been shrouded? Oh. Well, for extra point, bonus point, having gone into plural forms of Greek, in words like phenomenons, we know that this feminine noun, umbra, finds its plural form in umbrae, with the AE sound that we were taught by the sisters at St. Dominic. But for now, we shall just approach the penumbra of the general discussion upon the topic of the origins of coronaviruses, having already gone into viruses, the other topic, specifically human coronaviruses, of which the one with which you are probably most familiar has often been described as a novel one. And it would be especially novel if you did not know anything at all about the first, of which this is reported to be the seventh. Already in the seventh inning of coronavirus, and you just found out about it. Are you up for a mental adventure? Ready to boldly go where no man has gone before? As old Doc Martin, our logic professor, Yeah, we were wearing Doc Martens before Doc Martens were popular, but we were going to philosophy class. Our logic professor used to say, "Are you ready to set sail to the deep oceans to begin to rebuild your ship at sea, ripping first at the floorboards to feel the water rushing up at your face? Because just like resolving anomalies is the work of a real scientist to develop a theory that can be replicated and predict future outcomes with a pretty stable or static paradigm as its goal, to be on solid rock. The goal of a philosopher is to seek the truth and nothing but the truth. Live long and prosper, star voyagers. This briefing is unclassified. As you know, my name is Major Mike Webb, and by God, I am running for Arlington Public School Board. Let's keep Mike Webb away from our schools. Honest. Carry on. This advertisement was authorized by Mike Webb. Thunk, I could have had a vaccine.